Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone to the Men's Fellowship. Just as a way of quick introduction, for those who haven't joined us before, Men's Fellowship welcomes all men regardless of their background or beliefs, and we explore the relevance of faith to everyday life, particularly through hearing the stories of other men as they navigate their life. It's a safe place where people talk about things that are less on their CV and more about the challenges at work and home and life, and how their faith has been relevant to that. And we do that mainly through, as I said, through listening to speakers. And today we are absolutely delighted and honoured to have Professor John Wyatt speaking to us from London at about 10 p.m. his time. So thank you very much, John, for joining us. John is Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Pediatrics, Ethics, and Perinatology at University College London, a very prestigious university, as I'm sure you know. As a neonatologist, John's devoted his medical career to prevention of brain damage in newborn infants and has done much of the groundbreaking research that's transformed lives in that area. In the course of his work, of course, he needs to support parents at what is a very vulnerable moment in their life. John's own personal experiences have been a gift that have allowed him to comfort others. And we're absolutely delighted to have John here to speak to us today. And Peter, looking forward to hearing what John has to say.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. Welcome, John.
No, thanks. It's very good to be here. It's a hot, steamy evening in London, so I'm mopping my brow. We don't go in for air conditioning in the UK, but it's good to be here anyway.
Yes, we've seen that there's been a heat wave in Europe. You probably know that most of the east coast of Australia has been awash with rain, but our turn will come with the heat before long. Well, John, thank you so much for staying up till this hour and indeed for being prepared to share with us. It's, as Walter said, a great privilege. But I do think we have to start with that rather long title of yours. Can you unpack a little bit what exactly you are or you do?
Yeah, I usually describe myself as a baby doctor. So I spent most of my medical career caring for babies, newborn babies who need special help. Some of them incredibly premature, going right down to 500 grams, just over a pound in weight, just literally fitting into the palm of my hand. Some of them babies born at the right time, but with really major life-threatening problems, brain damage or abnormalities and so on. So that's neonatal pediatrics. But in the later part of my career, I got more and more involved in ethical issues to do with medicine and technology and issues around the time of birth. So perinatology means literally before, around, and after birth. And so that's what that means.
Mm. So you must really see, I guess, both the amazing highs and joys of birth, but also really the opposite, the trauma, I guess, given the nature of your speciality.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I must have attended hundreds, probably thousands of births, and every time I've been there, there's been a particular sort of frisson of it's a special event when a new life comes into the world. And yet, again, some of my focus has been on babies where things have gone catastrophically wrong. And, many times I've held in my arms a dying baby and felt moved to tears and wept with the parents over such a painful and horrendous experience. So it is absolutely highs and lows.
Mm-hmm. We'll certainly come back and explore that last bit you shared in a moment. But your career has spanned a number of decades, and as Walter said, you would have seen a number of advances, and you've participated in some of that research yourself. Can you give us a sense for what you've actually seen? What are the advances you have seen in your career?
Yes, neonatology has been an amazingly rapidly developing field of medicine. And it was one of the things that attracted me into it when I was in my 20s. And when I started, it was still almost like a Wild West. We were trying things out. There was very little certain that we knew that worked. And over the sort of 30 years or more that I've been involved in this specialty, we've seen remarkable advances. And I have the privilege of being part of a big research team trying to investigate how it was that some babies suffered brain damage during the birth process, and whether there was anything we could do to make a difference. And it's been a problem that I've been agonizing over and battling with for decades. And to my amazement, the work that I was involved in, including other groups around the world, gradually led to new insights into how the brain damage happened at birth, and then eventually to a new way of treating it. So I saw a mad idea on the back of an envelope 20 years ago suddenly develop and evolve into something that has now become standard treatment for babies in many places around the world.
Wonderful. And I'm assuming the survival rates therefore have improved.
Yes, they have dramatically, particularly for the babies right down at the limits of viability, right at the very earliest stages. So a normal pregnancy is 40 weeks gestation, 9 months. And it's now possible for babies at 23 weeks, 22 weeks, even 21 weeks to survive. And many of the babies are now surviving at the limits. We've been following them through childhood and on into adulthood. And many of them are doing amazingly well. Just recently, I had the privilege of meeting a baby born at 23 weeks that I cared for, and who is now just graduated from university. As a fine young woman of 21. So it's remarkable to see, remembering her as this tiny little sprat that we were caring for in an intensive care unit.
Okay. Sprat must be sort of one of your internal technical words.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah. It's a professional word we use.
Professional word, yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. But were you always going to be a doctor? And you know, what you've sort of hinted why you drew to this field, but tell a little bit about the backstory, your journey.
Yes, I didn't. Never planned to be a doctor initially. My great interest was science, and in particular physics and cosmology. As a young boy, adolescent, studied physics, and then went to university, Oxford University, and studied physics there initially. And it was really my first year at university that I was having quite a major life crisis about my own future and what I really believed. I'd come from a very conservative or fundamentalist kind of Christian background, and yet when I left home, I was really wondering, could I believe any of that stuff that I felt I'd been indoctrinated by, or should I throw it all away and just focus on being a scientist? And it was really in that first year that, as I wrestled with this and talked to other people and came across a number of other Christians in the university, that my own personal faith came alive. And it was not only could I see that the Christian faith could be intellectually credible for me as a scientist, but also it was the discovery that Jesus was real, Jesus was a person. And so I went through this crisis in these first months in university. And then coming out of that, quite to my surprise, I developed a kind of conviction that I should give up physics and focus on medicine, that I was being called in some ways to be a doctor. And I didn't really understand what that meant or why that should be, but it just seemed a very strong conviction.
So that conviction remained with you. And would you say that really has permeated all your work, that you have this strong sense of doing God's work in a sense?
Well, that sounds a bit sort of over the top, doesn't it? I'm not sure I'd put it quite that bluntly, but in the sense that we're all of us called to do God's work. But there was something about medicine was I felt that it was a way of using the science that I was good at for the people that God cared about. And I think that fundamental conviction has stayed with me through, the highs and the lows, some wonderful times, some very dark times in my work as a doctor.
Mm. So you're caring for the people that God cares for, as you say. You did mention that you've held little babies in your hands that are dying, and obviously there are parents there. So, yeah, can you give us some insight to how do you cope with that? How do you seek to comfort people? Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course, for a parent, this is like the ultimate nightmare, isn't it? Any of you who are parents, and my wife and I have had the privilege of having 3 boys, all born at the same hospital where I was working, which is a very stressful business. And it's the idea that actually this precious baby might be dying is like the ultimate nightmare, isn't it, for parents? And so I do have a sense. It was interesting. Although I was doing this work before I became a parent, it was after I became a parent that I became much more aware of the emotional impact, because I identified with a way, this could be me, this could be me on the other chair in the other side of the room. And what I realized was that in the catastrophic situation, what people most needed was not just a cool professional, somebody who would just impart information in this cool analytical way. What they needed above all was a human being who cared, somebody who could be with them and support them and act maybe as a wise friend. And so just trying to be a presence. Later on, I came across a very profound saying that says, suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. This idea of just being there with people who are suffering, people who are in agony. And I came to realize that was an incredible privilege, that I could be there and try and be that presence with people who are facing this ultimate tragedy.
Mm. And it sounds like from the example you gave of that premature baby that just graduated from uni, that you've kept a close personal interest in many of your patients and families.
Yeah, that's true. And I've had the privilege of meeting a whole number of them, and sharing that excitement of seeing how they've gone on through life. Some of them with real struggles, sometimes, children and adults who sustain some kind of brain damage, maybe cerebral palsy and so on. So I've seen some of the struggles that families and people with disabilities have, but it's been an enormous privilege to be part of their lives, and particularly at that very critical juncture when they'd first come into the world.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that of late you've focused a lot on the ethical questions that have arisen, and some of the advances that you've seen perhaps pose these questions. Can you sort of give us some insight into what you're referring to there?
Yeah, well, neonatology is a very technologically sophisticated and advanced field of medicine. It depends on continually advancing technology. And as the technology improves and we can do more and more, I found it raised more and more ethical questions. Is it ever right to switch off the life support machinery? And what about the whole issue of abortion? Because in the same hospital where I was struggling to save incredibly tiny and vulnerable little babies, just one floor away, abortions were being carried out when some kind of abnormality of the unborn baby had been found. And I was being called up from the neonatal unit to go and talk to a mother who was considering having an abortion because later on in the pregnancy some abnormality had been found. And the baby in her womb was considerably bigger and tougher and stronger than some of the babies we were struggling to save one floor down. And then I'm saying, well, how is it possible in one hospital for these two apparently contradictory things to be going on? And how can I get my head around this? And how can I help others people try and work out what the right thing to do is? So as technology advances, it does raise these very, very profound challenges about what it means to be human, and what kind of society we want to build for the future.
So obviously you've wrestled with this a lot. Is your personal stance really on a case-by-case basis? Is this something that's not really binary, that has to be quite nuanced?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are some fundamental principles. I believe passionately that every human life is precious and is special and is to be protected as much as possible. And that applies both to life after birth, but also to the baby just before birth and on earlier into the pregnancy. But at the same time, we have to apply fundamental principles in very particular issues. And sometimes that's immensely complex. It's, as you say, it's nuanced. It can be very controversial. Sometimes my role is to support people, but ultimately they have to make decisions. They have to make choices, and they have to be accountable for their choices, as I'm accountable for my choices. And part of it, these are not just abstract philosophical questions. They're human issues, and they're people who struggle and are anxious and agonize. And so we should always remember, I get very frustrated when you hear these very polarized and simplistic debates going on about medical ethics, because we always got to remember these are human beings who are struggling and suffering.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand from what you've shared with me before that because of this polarization and some of the heat has led into conflict that you yourself have experienced. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, there's just a fireworks that's going on outside. I don't know if you can hear those.
We can. I thought it was a train, but yes.
As far as I know, warfare hasn't started, but you never quite know. Yes, although most of my work was primarily, working hands-on as a doctor, increasingly I found myself getting almost pushed into the public arena to try and engage in some of the big public debates. And so over the years, I've had the privilege of being involved in television, radio debates, also giving evidence in Parliament. And you never quite know how these things are going to go down in the public arena. But a number of years ago, I gave evidence in our UK Houses of Parliament to do about scientific advances in the care of newborn babies. And it was related to the abortion law and whether the abortion law at the time should be changed. And I just gave my evidence, I hope fairly dispassionately and carefully as a medical professional in the Parliament. But somewhat to my surprise, there was just over the next hours and days, there was a kind of media campaign against me. And I suddenly found I was being attacked. I was misleading Parliament. I was some weird religious fundamentalist who was abusing my position. I was an incompetent doctor. And I was just amazed at the sort of ferocity of the attack from a number of places. And then a politician made a private approach to the head of the university, the provost of University College London, and complained that a senior academic, i.e. me, was misleading Parliament, which in the British Constitution is just about the worst thing it's possible for you to do. Apart from blowing up the Queen, misleading Parliament is about the worst thing you can do. And so I was then hauled into the presence of the provost, and I'm thinking, good heavens, this is all about to be end in a very painful end of my career. But thankfully, there's a very strong protection for academics at University College London on freedom of speech. And the provost was able to confirm that I was giving my evidence honestly and that I hadn't intended to mislead, and so on and so on. And they then released a press release saying that they backed me there was this very painful period for about 2 or 3 days, and then thankfully the media spotlight moved on, and they moved on and attacked somebody else. But it was a very painful and challenging time, and quite frightening for me and my family.
Mm. And has that altered or informed how you now approach these issues?
Well, I still do put my head above the parapet from time to time. To be honest, now I have formally retired from the university, it's not quite so. It's easier for me to speak out in public because I don't have, as an emeritus professor, I don't have the same responsibility to my university. I've got greater freedom. But I think, unfortunately, I think when you do put your head above the parapet, sometimes on controversial and difficult topics, you can get absolutely taken apart. And I'm afraid it just goes along with the territory. It makes me very cautious about whether I really want to put myself into this position again. And yet sometimes, I feel a responsibility to stand up and be counted, particularly when it seems I'm trying to defend vulnerable and precious human beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, you certainly come across as someone with a lot of courage and very robust in these difficult situations. But there was a time in your life that it would be lovely if you were able to share with us where that perhaps was not the case. Can you please explain to us what sort of happened, I think, around the time you were about 50?
Yeah, that's right. Up until that point, I had always felt very internally robust, and I had a sort of reputation of being the psychiatrically most stable member of the team. And one by one, others of my colleagues had come and either literally or metaphorically wept on my shoulder, and I was the one who was strong and holding it all together. But I knew I was under an enormous amount of internal strain. I was become the most senior consultant on the neonatal unit, and I was dealing with some of the incredibly painful and difficult ethical and other personal issues. And at the same time, I was leading a massive research program, a randomized clinical trial with this new therapy we were developing. And then quite rapidly, I became incredibly unwell. I had weird things going on in my head. I started imagining all kinds of weird things, and it deteriorated. And I then had a major psychotic breakdown, and I sort of woke up in a locked psychiatric ward, and I had this period of total confusion and what on earth was going on, and then gradually came back to planet Earth, and it was a period of slow recovery. And then I had a second episode and ended up again in a locked psychiatric ward. And at that point, I thought I was completely destroyed. I thought, I'm never going to work again. I'm never going to have any kind of professional role. I'm going to have to watch my family struggle and with financially. And also, I felt I'm never going to be able to have any kind of role as a spokesperson, be involved publicly in the Christian faith. I felt a complete and utter disaster. And it was a very, very dark period. And if at that time someone had come along to me and tried to talk about God, I mean, God was a word with 3 letters. It meant nothing to me at all at that time. But what I did discover, the one thing that could sort of penetrate through this deep, dark pit in which I found myself, and that was the human love. That my wife came and visited and gave me a hug. A very close friend from came and just this human contact and human love was able to penetrate even into that really darkest place. And so there was then this slow period of recovery It took me months. I was off work for a number of months, gradually going back, deciding I needed to really change my working practice because I was under such a lot of pressure. But gradually, over a period of years, I came back to a new kind of awareness of new discovery, really. And as I look back now, I realize that I'm actually a rather different person from the person who was before all of this happened. And it has changed me. In fact, I've discovered that sometimes psychiatrists talk about a creative illness, that a psychiatric illness can actually, although immensely destabilizing and painful, can unlock creative forces. And I think that's happened for me, that it's taught me a lot more about myself and my vulnerability. It's taught me about the nature of suffering, but also about the way that God can actually bring blessing and healing out of the most terrible and tragic things that can happen to me and to other people. And so, I've sometimes speculated, if someone was to offer me that I could go back and wipe out that whole episode and just carry on being the professor and the senior consultant in the unit, I wouldn't take it, because although immensely painful, that the whole experience has become a kind of strange gift for me.
Wow. Thank you, John, for sharing that. If you don't mind, it'd be, I think, helpful for all of us to just understand a bit more about the depths to which you really sunk and felt. You said this took a number of months. So did you feel, you said humiliated, I think. Did you feel a failure in some sense?
I did. I felt it. My actual breakdown happened in a very public way. I was actually the consultant on call and in the hospital at the time. And so it was very public. It was very humiliating. And I felt a terrible failure. I felt that I'd let my wife and family down. I'd let my colleagues down. I'd let my God down. And those deep feelings of failure is also one of the symptoms of a kind of depressive illness, which I certainly went through quite a long depressive phase with, and often these sort of accusatory voices in your heads, you're useless, you always mess up, and sometimes with a kind of religious thing, God has had it with you, you're just useless, you always mess up.
Did you sort of ask the question, why me? Or that wasn't really something that you dwelt on?
No, it was a why me, and could it have been avoided, and so on, and those questions don't have an answer ultimately. I don't know why this happened to me and not to other people. I don't know why this particular thing happened. One thing I have, in reading and reflecting and talking to others, one thing I have noticed, and that is when you put the pressure upon somebody and bit by bit, you just squeeze the pressure more and more and more and more, eventually something will crack. But what it is that cracks is not always predictable. So it could be something physical, somebody has a heart attack or a stroke, or they're diagnosed with cancer. Or it could be, as in my case, psychiatric. What goes is that psychological element. Or it could be for sometimes that they suddenly form some great moral failure and something completely out of character. Somebody who was apparently very moral and upright then is found to be doing something completely out of character and a huge moral lapse. So I think you can never quite predict what it is that's going to go. But the interesting thing is that it seems that very often it's the thing that the person is strongest in is the thing that cracks. So the guy who is the fitness freak, who is totally and utterly dominated with his body, is the one who has the stroke. And the person who is incredibly psychologically stable, as I thought I was, is the one who has a psychiatric illness. And the person who is incredibly moral and upright is the one who has the moral lapse. So it's sometimes the area where we think we're the strongest, which turns out actually we're the most vulnerable.
Have you reflected on that from your, biblical or faith perspective? Is there a principle going on here, do you think?
Well, I think the principle is that if we rely on ourselves, if we, the truth was, although I had and still do have a really genuine and deep Christian faith, I was also quite intellectually arrogant. I thought, God has given me a good mind. And when everything falls about, the one thing that I can do is I can always think my way out of trouble. I can always work out the best solution. And it's like God took away the one thing on which I was relying. And so that never again am I ever going to be able to completely trust my mind, because I know my mind can go completely haywire. And I do think there's a spiritual principle there that and perhaps it's something particularly for men and for, quote, successful professional men. We tend to rely on something. We have our own, whatever it is, thing that we think, yeah, we can hack this. And the painful truth is that sometimes, in order for us to grow and develop, that crutch needs to be taken away from us.
Yeah, interesting reflection. So any advice, I guess, for us, either you said it was very sudden, but humiliating, so clearly you couldn't predict it coming, but any advice either for us who might be feeling or experiencing these things, or indeed how we can help others?
Well, I mean, one thing, of course, I discovered is that there is this incredible stigma about mental health. It's like it's okay to have a heart problem. It's okay to have cancer, but mental issues, they are, you just don't want to go there. There's a kind of shame. There's a stigma, and I think why I now think my experience has become a kind of gift is that by talking about it and deliberately choosing to talk about it, I hope I'm giving other people permission to be honest about some of their own struggles, some of the issues where they feel they are aware of things going on in their heads that worries them, worried about stress, worried about mental health issues. And my plea, if there are people listening to this who feel you come into that category, is that you talk to somebody. Don't just bottle it up. Don't just assume that you can be tough and brazen it out, but talk to somebody you trust and find help. And certainly, I would be delighted to talk in confidence or be in contact with somebody if somebody on this call wanted to talk to me about some of these mental health issues. But Peter, I'm sure there are other people in Australia that you would know of who people could talk to as well.
No, thank you, John. That's very kind to offer that. So, John, you are the emeritus professor. So, final question from me for the moment. How do you stay curious? How do you stay active? What gets you out of bed at the moment?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the world in which we live, and particularly the world of technology, and by how to relate my own Christian faith and understanding about what it means to be human with these real major advances in technology. So I'm currently doing research into the area of artificial intelligence and robotics, and asking the question, how on earth, what kind of world is coming because of AI? In fact, I edited a book called The Robot Will See You Now, which has been published. And yeah, so I think I think it's an amazing time to be alive. The speed of changes that are going on in the world of technology, and both the opportunities and promises of some of the new technologies, but also some of the challenges and threats which are coming over the horizon. It's an exciting time to be alive, and I think we need people to really engage with some of these issues, and particularly with some of the ethical issues that are being raised, and say, what kind of world do we want to build for our children?
Thank you, John. Wonderful. Well, we're very thankful that you are active in these questions, and thanks for sharing so much with us this morning. I'm going to unmute Stuart, who has a question.
Yeah, Professor, good evening. I want to say thank you. 1945, my father was born with neonatal asphyxia. I've met Sir Peter Gluckman, one half of the cooling cap, and now, by God's grace, I meet the other half. Thank you for your work, because in the future, there'll be a lot less of people like my dad as a result of what you do. Perhaps you might share with this group about your revolutionary work on the cooling cap.
Yes, so Peter Gluckman is absolutely right, is my co-conspirator in crime. He's a professor in New Zealand. And we both of us quite independently became very interested in the evidence that cooling newborn babies, paradoxically, could actually be beneficial. So we were all taught as doctors that the single most important thing is you have to keep babies warm after birth. And if they get cold, terrible, disastrous things happen. But gradually there was accumulating scientific evidence and neuroscience showing that if you reduced brain temperature by even 3 or 4 degrees in babies who were at real risk of cerebral palsy because of problems at birth, you could switch off a lot of the damaging reactions. And so we were both involved in lab experiments, Peter in New Zealand, us in London, and then we agreed together that we would be part of a trial, and we developed a cooling cap, a little water-cooled device to put on babies' heads, to reduce brain temperature. And so together we were part of an international randomized trial. We put half of these babies, all at high risk of brain damage, in to receive standard intensive care, and half of them to receive cooling. And then we looked at what happened to them, and much to my amazement, it turned out that the babies who'd received cooling had lower rates of death and lower rates of cerebral palsy and brain damage. And so that was the first major trial which showed that cooling actually made a difference.
Wonderful. I have a question that came through on the private chat from A. Joseph. What was the defining step, or were there people involved that kind of strengthened your faith? And what empowers your faith today?
I think going back all that time to when I was a student, I think it was a process. What I discovered was I needed to test and challenge my Christian faith to see whether Christianity could be intellectually credible. I mean, for me, interested in science and technology, the idea that I would have to give up all of that if I was going to follow Christ seemed very, very hard to take. And therefore, I wanted to know whether Christianity really was true and whether it was relevant in the modern world. And that was really the main thing, I think, about reading, testing, arguing, asking questions. But then there was a second phase, as I mentioned before, as I suddenly became increasingly convinced, I can remember praying, Lord, if you're real, make yourself plain to me, and praying that prayer repeatedly, and then developing suddenly this sense, actually, it was real in a way that was very hard to explain, a personal sense of the presence and reality of Jesus in my life. And that is something that has stayed with me in the ups and the downs, a sense of his amazing love, of his reality, of the truth of his life, and it's still something that is with me now, and is perhaps the most important thing in my life.
Gentlemen, if you'd like to send me a message, you're welcome, or if you want to raise your hand, please do so. Just whilst I'm waiting for that, you obviously had a big down. Did that at all, I mean, you said the word God was just 3 letters when that happened. Did it at all ever lead to a crisis of faith?
Certainly, it led to a real black period and questions and doubts. I think I never really doubted God's existence. What I more doubted was his goodness. It felt almost as though I was being tortured. And I don't know if anyone has ever read a book by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed. Lewis was a very well-known Christian academic in Oxford and wrote a number of Christian books, including books about the problem of pain. But then he went through a personal tragedy when his wife died, and he wrote a book called A Grief Observed. And initially, it was written anonymously, and it was only after his death that it was then acknowledged that this was actually written by C.S. Lewis. But it's a very, very powerful and remarkable book, and I reread it as I went through this experience and resonated with so much of what Lewis said of experiencing grief and loss and pain from the inside. So I strongly recommend it, a book called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis.
We've got a few more questions now that have come into me, and I'll get to Ken on the raise hand in a moment. But whilst we're on this theme, there's a question here. During this crisis, were there things that your Christian friends did that were helpful or unhelpful for you?
That's a really good question. Probably a bit of both. I think the things that were most helpful, as I said, was just the expressions of love, and particularly the physical expressions. You know, because we are human beings, we need to hear words of affirmation. We need to have physical arms around us. And the amazing thing is that God's love can be mediated to us in physical ways. And many times over the years, I've been involved in horrific and inexplicable tragedies. And you say to yourself, where is God in this situation? Because it seems as though it's almost obscene to say that this is part of God's plan. The situation is so horrific and awful. But the one thing that I have recognized time and again is God is in his people. God is reaching out, but he's reaching out in his people or through people. And so I think it's an amazing privilege if we don't have to come up with great long theological explanations and discussions. What we have to do is try to be there and to express love and support and encouragement. I think that's the most helpful thing. The thing that was unhelpful, I think, was there's a kind of prurient interest which some people have when you've had a psychiatric illness. And you sometimes you get, you know, when people are asking questions and they're meaning it in a sensitive and loving way, but sometimes people just seem pruriently fascinated by your experience in a way which makes you feel like a specimen. It doesn't feel like it's a genuine concern. It's something which is, and it's almost horrified, what happened to you and might it happen to me, sort of thing. So I think when there are people who are struggling with mental health issues and who are very vulnerable, it's very important to treat them sensitively and carefully and to show love in a genuine way, but also to protect them sometimes from this kind of prurient curiosity and invasive and unpleasant invasive interest.
Thank you. Question from Ken.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, John. Thank you enormously for the presentation you've given. Some of the things you've said are really helpful to those of us who are involved in pastoral engagements with people. My question just draws on some of the things you said. You commented on how very personal much of your engagement with people has been, and holding dying babies. There's nothing much more personal than that. And now you're dealing with artificial intelligence, which kind of seems to be about as far away from personal as it's possible to be. Can you talk to us a bit about why you've moved in that direction, and also where are the big ethical issues that you see in the emerging world of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, thanks very much. They're not as far apart as you might think. I mean, on the surface, I could totally see what you're saying. What I have sensed in as technology advances, it raises this question: what does it mean to be human? With a new way, what does it mean to be human if you are born at 22 weeks gestation and you weigh 500 grams and you've got brain damage? What does it mean to be human if you're just being kept alive by life support machinery? What does it mean to be human if we can change your brain chemistry and structure by technological means? And I think that AI is asking that question in a new and very challenging way. What does it mean to be human if we can simulate every aspect of your humanity and make it so convincing that you really can't tell the difference whether this is a real human being or whether this is a simulated human being? And so I think from a Christian point of view, I am utterly committed to the idea that human beings are special. Human beings are different. One of the things the Bible says is that human beings are created in the image of God. There's something godlike about them. They reflect them. But there are many people out there who say, actually, we can create beings who are so close to being human that you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And so I do see this as exciting, but also very challenging. And it's all about what it means to be human and how to protect humanity as we move into this brave new world.
I have a question on the chat just connected to that. When does human life begin, and to what extent is there a consensus among the experts in your field?
Yeah, well, you won't be surprised to hear that that's a question I get asked very often. And whenever I'm asked it, I try to push back very gently and say, I don't actually think that's the right question. Because whatever is in the womb, we know that it's living and we know that it's human. Why is it human? Because it came out of the body of a human. Why is it living? Because it came out of a living human body. So if you ask the question, when does human life begin? The answer is way back in you're talking about the origins of humanity. So the question is not, everybody agrees that what is in the womb is human and is living. The question is not, when does human life begin? The question is, when is there a person who I have a duty to protect? And when you put it like that, you realize that actually that's not a scientific question. That's a moral, philosophical, theological question. And my own answer is, however far you go back in your own personal history, however far you go back in the womb, you will it's always you, that you never come to a point at where you say, that's not me, that's just a blob. And therefore, my conclusion is that I have a duty to try and protect life right back to the very earliest stages, because I don't know whether or not there's a person there. I can't be absolutely certain, and therefore I should protect life to its very earliest stages. Now, that is a highly contested question. It's a question which people differ about, is scientists, obstetricians, philosophers. And as we know about what's going on in the States at the moment, it's a highly politicized question as well. So I think ultimately it's not a scientific question. It's a moral and a philosophical question. I'd be happy to talk more about it. If you're interested, I wrote a book called Matters of Life and Death, where I've got a whole chapter called When is a Person, which deals with that. And I have a website, johnwyatt.com, with a lot of the material is available for free download from my website. For anybody who wants to explore that further, there are lots of resources there.
Thank you. I'll get to the raised hands in just a moment, but there is a chat question directly connected to what you just said. Just briefly, given the polarization you mentioned in America, but this question is about, do you have any suggestions on how to have a fruitful discussion about sensitive issues such as this one?
Yeah, well, the most important thing is to try to avoid this horrific polarized debate where people just lob grenades at one another. There's no kind of listening. There's no genuine meeting of minds. And I absolutely try and avoid that if at all possible. I think the most important thing is that we should be involved in listening and respectful dialogue. And above all, we've got to listen to the people who are involved, which is primarily women with unplanned pregnancies. I mean, it's so interesting in the Roe versus Wade politicized debate. The women themselves are just like tools on both sides. They're ammunition that are being used for politics. So I've had the privilege of being involved with the Crisis Pregnancy Centre here in London. I'm one of the trustees. My wife was a director for many years. And they reach out to women with unplanned pregnancy and their partners, and they provide compassionate, a safe place, sensitivity, truth, and support, practical support. And I think that is the way forward. It's listening, it's showing compassion, it's looking for alternatives. And one of the things that has happened many times here in London is that women who are planning to have an abortion, once they have the chance, a safe place to talk about their options and so on, and they realize there is support and practical support available, many of them decide to continue the pregnancy, and the charity provides free equipment and support and encouragement. And so I think there is a better way than this horrific and very negative polarized campaign, but it takes, I think, real sensitivity and a preparedness to listen.
Okay, thank you. Just to give you a heads up, we've got probably about another 3 questions in about 3 minutes, so we'll need to keep it reasonably brief, but maybe we can go over for a second. But I've got a question from Ian.
Thanks, Peter. John, thank you very much for such a heartfelt, as one other person pointed out, but also open and vulnerable presentation this morning. I'm in academic life myself, and I was very encouraged to hear that UCL supported you when you were subject to such vilification. What I wondered, John, was how your colleagues responded to your Christian faith. You mentioned that a number of people had come and cried on your shoulder, metaphorically. I wonder whether that was related to the fact that you were made it clear that you were a Christian and therefore they felt free to do that. But just more generally, how colleagues in your department and elsewhere around the university responded to your obvious Christian faith.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question. UCL, as you may or may not know, has a reputation of being the first totally atheistic university that was set up in the UK. And so it has no theology department, it has no chapel, no chaplains. And so it was always rather amusing that they were paying me to practice medicine and also to teach ethics to medical students. And so sometimes, I was definitely walking a tightrope in terms of trying to work out what I could get away with and what was going to lead me the sack. But inevitably there was a lot of fairly light-hearted teasing. I mean, I had a colleague of mine who was a staunch atheist, an excellent doctor, and we were very good friends. But, occasionally it was like, well, I don't know what's wrong with this baby. You'd better talk to John. He's got the hotline, and things like that. But I do remember another time when we were just talking quite seriously about how our different beliefs influenced our medical practice. And he said to me, John, when we're both caring for dying babies, it's different for you. When you're caring for a dying baby, you're sending them to heaven. And when I'm caring for a dying baby, I'm sending them to the rubbish heap. And it was meant as a joke, but actually we both knew it was true. There was a sense in which what our fundamental beliefs make a difference to the way we practice. So I had a whole range of reactions, some incredulity, some teasing, and yet I think you're right that often in private, people would come and talk to me and sometimes weep with me. I think because they trusted me and they knew my faith and they respected it. And sometimes people said that to me. They said that, I want to practice medicine the way you do because I know you're doing it for a reason.
John, one last question we will have here. It's come on the chat. As someone struggling with their faith, questioning whether God exists after being a Christian for 20 years, how do you reconcile the manner in which, quote, God reaches us through his people with some of the ways in which he does that? Death of a child, deformations. Why would God allow that?
Yeah. And of course, these are questions which I have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with. And I don't have any neat answers or explanations. And, in the end, you have to say the things which we think are evil are not evil at all. They're just meaningless. I shall avoid using expletive, but the expletive. Expletive happens. Bad things happen. Get with the project. And that is really all that atheism has to say about evil. It's meaningless. Even what's going on in Ukraine, terrible things and a bomb comes. It's meaningless. It's a joke. It's a sick joke. I think deep inside, we can't really accept that. We can't, or at least I can't, and I know many other people can't. I cannot accept that it's all meaningless. And therefore, what's the alternative? And I think the alternative, which is there's so much evidence for, is actually there is a God out there. And that God is not some kind of fascist or torturer, but is actually a God of love. And so how do I know that? Well, ultimately, I look to Jesus because, it's in Jesus. If Jesus really was God in human form, he doesn't explain suffering. He enters into it. He takes it into his own body. And there's this profound thinking that in a strange sort of way, our little suffering, it gets caught up into the big story, this big story that suffering is not the end of the story. In the end, suffering does not win. Evil does not win. Suffering can be redeemed and turned into blessing and healing. And ultimately, I believe that. That's where I'm going to stake my claim. I've seen it happen in my life. I've seen it happen in many other lives as well. I don't understand it, but I believe it's true. Suffering is not the end of the story.
Well, thank you so much, John. And again, thank you for joining us. Gentlemen, thank you for staying on. I'm going to be extremely brief now. I will send out a feedback email and you will have the opportunity to reply if you would like to take up John's offer of having some more assistance, or indeed I can try to point you to other sources of help. We do encourage men to consider joining small discussion groups. John has raised so many valuable things for us to think through, and it would be great if you could participate in those groups and share with the other men. So take up the opportunity in the feedback email to join one of those groups, either in person or online. We can look after you. I'm going to invite Al Stewart to say a short prayer, and we next meet in this forum on the 2nd of September, if you want to note that date. Thank you, Al.
Thanks, Peter. We'll say a prayer. Dear God, thank you for how you've obviously been at work in John's life. Thank you for his trust in Jesus, and thank you how that makes such a difference as he deals with people in such difficult times in their lives. We thank you for the wisdom and the skill you've given him, and that he's been able to do so much good for so many people. Thank you for the hard lessons that he's learned, lessons of humility and compassion. And Father, we do pray for all of us listening today that we might learn to rely on you, and that we might learn those lessons of humility before you, to rely on you, and also to learn the humility to be able to reach out to others for help, especially in the area of mental health. We ask, please, we might think long and hard on what we've learned today, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Al. And again, thank you, John, and have a good day and weekend ahead, gentlemen.